It's about 2:01, so I think maybe we will get started. My name is Kimberly Gerling. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Evidence for Democracy. For those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit based here in Ottawa that works on promoting the use of evidence in government decisions. And we're super excited today to have you join us for a special webinar with the Toronto Science Policy Network to share with us the results of the recent report looking at how COVID-19 has impacted graduate students. So we're super excited to have them here with us today. And I'm going to introduce our speakers in just a second, but before I do that, I just wanted to give a few housekeeping notes for the event. So you can see there's quite a lot of attendees here with us today. So for that reason, we're going to have all of our attendees muted over the course of the event to make sure that our lovely speakers are not going to be interrupted by background noises. But if you do have a question or you're having any issues technically, please pop them into the chat on Zoom, or you can use the Q&A as well. We are going to leave quite a bit of time at the end for question and answer with all of the panelists and the attendees today. But if you do have a question that comes up during the talk, feel free to pop it in there and we will get to it throughout the end of the event. And then also, I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge the fact that I'm here in Ottawa, which is on the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the St. Lawrence Iroquois, the Anishinaabe people, the Mohawk, and the Algonquin people. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we are on unsurrendered land. I know we're all in sort of virtual places, but it's an important thing to acknowledge as well. I think that's it for housekeeping on my end. So before I hand it over to our speakers, I want to introduce them. So I'll let them sort of introduce the Toronto Science Policy Network because I know they're going to do so in their talk. But our two speakers with us today are Sivani Baskaran. So Sivani is a PhD candidate in environmental chemistry at the University of Toronto. She's looking at methods for measuring and predicting physical chemical properties important in identifying chemicals that can build up in air-breathing species. She became very interested in science policy during her undergrad degree, and she has served on the Grad Student Association at Scarborough for 2 years, where she coordinated their student seminar series. She's also been the co-chair for the University of Toronto's Environmental Chemistry Colloquium, and she is one of the co-founders of the Toronto Science Policy Network in 2018. She's also, the Toronto Science Policy Network has worked with us here at E4D on the Vote Science campaign, and she was quite active in getting a part of that, being a part of that over the course of the federal election as well. And she now serves as the Toronto Science Policy President for the 2020-2021 academic year. And then we also have Frank Telfer, who gave us a wave. Yeah, so Frank is a graduate student in medical biophysics at the University of Toronto, and he's studying genetics and genome biology at the Hospital for Sick Kids. His research is looking at identifying and characterizing pharmacological events or approaches for reducing cancer risk in children and young adults who are suffering from hereditary predispositions. Outside the lab, he's passionate about expanding and improving science culture in his local community and across Canada. And he has a leadership role and participates in a variety of education and advocacy initiatives. He's co-chair of the Medical Biophysics Community Outreach, where he spearheads the development of science programming for students coming from underrepresented backgrounds in post-secondary education. He's a show host with the Raw Talk podcast, which is a really cool podcast I've been a part of before. He's also a committee member, former external affairs director, and current vice president of the Toronto Science Policy Network. And Frank also worked with us on the Vote Science Initiative, so we're super excited to be collaborating with them again. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to pass it on to our speakers now. I'm also going to hide my video, but I'm still here and I can respond to any of your chats and questions as they come up. But welcome to our Toronto Science Policy Network guests.
Thank you, Kimberly, for the introduction. Can you see my screen okay?
Looks good on my end.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you again, Kimberly, for the introduction, and to Evidence for Democracy for giving us this platform to talk about how COVID-19 is impacting graduate students in Canada. We also wish to begin by acknowledging the history and the lens that in which we are each living. Canada is home to many different Indigenous peoples, and we ask that you each take a moment to learn about and reflect upon the Indigenous peoples on whose lands you are currently working or living. Many of us in TSPN are located in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we also encourage you to visit these two websites, which provide a bit of history about Indigenous people in Canada and also can give you a bit more information on whose lands you are currently living on. So the Toronto Science Policy Network, or TSPN, was founded in 2018 and is a student-run science policy group at the University of Toronto. We aim to provide a platform for students and postdocs to learn about and engage in science policy. And to date, we've had over 300 participants from Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area participating in our events and advocacy initiatives. And these events include panels, talks, and workshops which help train and inform our members about the world of science and policy. We've also led and co-led a number of science advocacy campaigns, including the Vote Science campaign, which Kimberly mentioned, as well as things like this report and survey.
So we're here today to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on graduate students. But before we get into that, we wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of graduate students to science and the importance of science to society. I'm sure I don't need to tell this audience today just how important science is to society and just how important evidence-informed decision-making is to solving the challenges that we face. But I think it is important to reflect upon this in this particular moment. The importance of science really has never been more clear. We need science. We need strong science to inform the evidence to help to get us out of this particular crisis and indeed to help us face the crises that we will face in the future. So evidence-informed decision-making really needs good science and scholarship. But what is often perhaps not as well understood is the role of graduate students in that science. Graduate students really are the backbone of good science and scholarship. The vast majority of science that is being done at a post-secondary level in Canada is done by graduate students. These are the people that are studying the vaccines and the potential therapies for COVID-19. These are the people who are studying different ways that we can face up to the climate crisis, that we can perhaps stave off some of the impacts of that using novel technologies and so on. Graduate students are vital to advancing Canadian society and to driving our innovation economy forward. But unfortunately, graduate students are really struggling. Let's touch upon a few facts about graduate students in Canada. There are 175,000 graduate students enrolled at institutions across the country. And again, they do the majority of the post-secondary research in this country. But these graduate students are facing two major crises, a crisis of mental health and a crisis of funding. We start with mental health, and we start with this striking statistic. 49% of graduate students report struggling with their mental health. And indeed, graduate students suffer from mental health challenges such as anxiety and depression at a greater rate than the general population. Additionally, there is a crisis of funding. We start with this statistic. 70% of graduate students report challenges in obtaining funding. And I will underline and emphasize that these crises were long-standing, long before the pandemic. Graduate students were in quite a precarious position long before any of the impacts that we're going to be talking about today. In many ways, these impacts really just exacerbated existing problems. To get out of this pandemic, we need good science. We need evidence-informed policy. Evidence-informed policy, evidence-informed decision-making needs graduate students. So we start with this obvious question: why did we launch this survey? If I take us back to March, I'm sure we all recall that there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty. And indeed, this was the case for graduate students. In the academic sphere, courses were largely canceled or moved online. But in many institutions and in many departments within institutions, research was not necessarily canceled. There was a lot of confusion, mixed messages coming out of different departments, institutions, and indeed different provinces about research. So there was some clarity for undergraduate students, but not as much for graduate students. We also noticed that there were a lot of surveys being done, but these surveys were primarily focused on undergrads or were focused on post-secondary students broadly. There was not really any work being done to assess the impacts of the pandemic on graduate students in particular. Well, indeed, undergraduate students did face important challenges and will continue to face challenges going forward. We noted that given the importance of graduate students and their unique concerns, we wanted to be able to provide more information about what graduate students were experiencing at the time of the survey to help to inform decision-making about graduate students and how to best support them going forward. Of course, ultimately, one of the major reasons why we undertook the survey is because many of us in our team are, in fact, graduate students. Amongst this team of 17 collaborators, graduate students, and postdoctoral scholars, we were all, amongst this team, we experienced many of the impacts that we're going to be discussing today. So it's important to keep in mind that this work that was being done was work that was being done by graduate students and postdocs who were actively working during the pandemic and experiencing many of the things that we'll be talking about.
So we launched our survey in late April and it closed at the end of May. And it really captures a snapshot of what the graduate students in Canada were experiencing at this time. And we had an overwhelming response. Our survey was launched in English initially, and within about 2 weeks, we launched it in French as well. And we received about half of our respondents within the first week of our initial survey launch. And in total, we received 1,431 different graduate students who responded to our survey. And this includes students from across Canada, primarily in Ontario and Quebec, where we have the most number of research institutions. And we had responses from 45 different institutions in total. Many of our respondents were identifying as female and as white, and a large number of our respondents were also domestic students and studying full-time. We also had good representation from different types of programs and academic divisions, which include research stream programs and professional stream programs, as well as doctoral and master's students. We also had students responding from the humanities, social sciences, physical sciences, and life sciences. And so here, when we talk about research stream students, we're talking about programs which involve the production of a thesis, while professional stream students are generally course-based and can involve a practicum or internship component. And so we feel that this is a really good representation of the different types of programs and academic backgrounds for graduate students in Canada. And the experiences of each graduate student can be quite different. So we're going to be telling you the stories of a couple different graduate students during COVID-19, which is reflective of the experiences many graduate students faced during April and May this year. These stories are an amalgamation of the experiences and of the responses that we received from graduate students and are not representative of a specific person. We're going to start by talking about Quinn, who's a research stream graduate student, and Taylor, who's a professional stream graduate student. And as we tell you these stories and experiences, we will also talk about what governments, institutions, PIs, and departments can do to help support their graduate students.
We'll begin with the story of Quinn. After many months of preparation, Quinn was looking forward to going abroad and conducting their first season of research in the field. However, by mid-March, labs and institutions shut down, and Quinn was not sure how this was going to impact their plans. Told to work from home, Quinn did not know what was expected of them and was rarely meeting or interacting with their supervisor or lab group. Quinn's experiences were not unique. About 40% of respondents were unsatisfied with the level of communication they received regarding their research, their degree requirements, and their funding. Over 50% across all academic divisions indicated that their expectations were unclear, or they received no communication regarding what was expected of them in terms of remote work during the pandemic. There was also a general decrease in how frequently graduate students were meeting with their supervisors and research groups, with approximately 20% of students rarely meeting with their research groups or supervisors at the time of the survey. In professional stream programs, 88% of respondents were not contacted about the impact of COVID-19 on their time to completion or any associated costs. Before anything else, it is critical that clear and direct lines of communication are established between graduate students and their supervisors, departments, and institutions. And this can be achieved in a number of ways. First, institutions, departments, and supervisors need to improve the clarity and frequency of communication taking place. Additionally, they need to create clear and accessible guidelines regarding the return to institutions, which is already underway, but things will need to adapt as more students start in September. There's also need to set out general guidelines for productivity and work expectations for graduate students. So departments and supervisors should provide some clarity about what kind of work students should be doing or can be doing and the amount of time that should be spent on that work. Additionally, and perhaps most importantly, it is imperative that supervisors meet with their graduate students at least on a monthly basis to ensure their well-being and to offer support and practical suggestions to alleviate challenges through this difficult and confusing time.
Now I'm going to talk about Taylor, who is a professional stream graduate student who's working part-time to help cover the costs of their tuition while completing their coursework. They were planning to complete a summer internship before the pandemic, which led to its cancellation. And now they're really worried about their finances. Taylor was unsure about how this and COVID-19 would be impacting their time to degree completion and what costs might be associated with having to extend their timeline. Taylor is also a parent and is concerned about childcare when returning to school. Both professional stream and research stream graduate students reported increasing concerns regarding the state of their finances. There was widespread concern regarding paying for tuition, rent, credit cards, and student loans. They were also increasingly worried about their sources of income, including teaching assistantships, research assistantships, and stipends. Some are having to find additional work to help cover their costs of living. Of all our survey respondents, 31% of all graduate students responded indicating that childcare was a part of their finances. And of these students, 29% indicated that they are concerned about paying for this childcare. It's often assumed that research stream graduate students have funding to complete their research. However, 30% of research stream graduate students do not receive any kind of stipend. And another 45% indicate that their funding is not guaranteed till the end of the degree, or it requires an extension. Many students will likely have little financial support if COVID-19 leads to extended degree timelines. It is important that both institutions and governments work towards reducing the financial burden faced by graduate students and introduce flexibility into degree completion times. To do this, we ask governments continue the extension of student loan repayment programs and increase the proportion of funding provided as grants rather than loans. We ask governments and institutions to introduce tuition reduction or waiver programs, especially for the graduate students in financial need. Institutions need to clarify and adjust their expectations regarding degree completion times and funding packages, introducing mechanisms to extend the stipends of graduate students in cohorts with guaranteed funding by at least one semester or the length of the pandemic to help account for the delays in research that will be ongoing. Institutions, departments, and supervisors all need to provide additional support for students with responsibilities outside of their studies, particularly for programs which are generally full-time. The option to study part-time, at least during the pandemic, should be provided to them.
Let us return to the story of Quinn. Quinn lives alone. Confined to their home and highly concerned with what they were seeing in the news in the early stage of the pandemic, and with building uncertainty surrounding their research, Quinn began to experience feelings of loneliness and anxiety. Though Quinn tried to make a plan to stay busy during their isolation and stayed in contact with friends online, the feelings began to worsen, making work impossible. Over time, Quinn began to disengage more and more and was not communicating with anyone. Worried about their deteriorating mental health, Quinn reached out to the mental health services on their campus, but was unable to connect with anyone. Quinn began to strongly consider taking a leave of absence. An increasing proportion of graduate students are experiencing feelings of helplessness, being overwhelmed, loneliness, depression, or anxiety, with 72% of students experiencing such feelings, indicating an increased severity, as we see in this chart. In yellow, we have increased, or in red, we have significantly increased severity of feelings. So graduate student mental health declined significantly. Additionally, on the point of leaves of absence, at the time of the survey, 26% of graduate students were considering a long-term leave. Strikingly, as we can see on the graph as well, that is a 16% increase compared to prior to COVID-19. 38% of graduate students expressed dissatisfaction with the mental health services being provided at their institution. As I alluded to in the introduction, previous studies have laid bare the mental health crisis amongst graduate students in this country and indeed around the world. And the pandemic has only made this worse. It is essential that we work to improve existing health and wellness support systems available at institutions. And we can do this in a number of ways. First, governments should continue to invest in and improve the kinds of mental health resources and supports that are available. Institutions also need to improve and specifically to reduce wait times for counseling services, as well as to provide mental health training to faculty, students, and staff. Institutions should also provide clear and easily accessible directions for how students can access these mental health supports, since this itself often presents a challenge. Institutions need to also, on the point of long-term leaves of absence, increase the flexibility, particularly regarding application deadlines and the support being provided during the leave of absence. In this period of tremendous uncertainty, it is inappropriate to put arbitrary deadlines on leaves of absence, since there's great likelihood that the circumstances for individual students will change dramatically. Institutions also need to provide physically distant childcare on campus or emergency funding to support graduate students with dependence on childcare, amongst other issues, since they are facing an ever greater burden during this particular pandemic. Returning to the story of Quinn. As time progressed, it became quite clear that Quinn's international field season would be canceled. Having only just begun their research in September and no longer able to collect any data this summer, Quinn was not sure if they'd be able to complete sufficient work to publish a thesis, and even if they were, whether it would be of the necessary quality to advance their career. With little communication from their supervisor and a lack of access to the necessary lab equipment or resources for training, Quinn could not easily conceive of an alternative direction for their research. Unable to work from home, and with future research productivity uncertain at best, Quinn finally decided to take a leave of absence from their degree. Like Quinn, 78% of research stream graduate students who were planning to either study or conduct research abroad had to cancel their plans. Over 60% of research stream students across all academic divisions, so that's inclusive of the social sciences and humanities, required some access to physical space for their research. So in the context of the social science and humanities, students often reported a need for certain library resources, amongst other things that were not available off campus. In the physical and life sciences, over 80% of students relied on access to a physical space. 63% of students indicated that COVID-19 would have some impact on the time to completion for their degree. The impact of COVID-19 on research has been massive and multifaceted, and we've only touched on the aspects relating to graduate students. But as we've mentioned, graduate students really are at the forefront of Canadian research, so it's really quite vital that institutions and governments work to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the ability of graduate students to conduct the vital research for society. There are a few ways that we can address this. For the federal government needs to extend expiring federal scholarships on an as-needed basis, which in many cases they have, as well as to introduce needs-based financial awards to which all research stream graduate students can apply. Additionally, the federal government should also work to increase the number of graduate scholarships and awards being offered via the 3 federal funding agencies. Graduate students were already facing significant concerns surrounding funding long before the pandemic. And of course, COVID-19 has only exacerbated these concerns. So there's a need to not only just extend the pre-existing scholarships, but to provide a greater pool so that more students can have that stability of funding through their studies. In doing so, the federal government also needs to prioritize equity, diversity, and inclusion in the allocation of funds. Institutions should also develop contingency plans in the event of a second wave. As we've alluded to and as we discussed in more detail in the report, many research activities were more or less impossible during the shutdown. So it is important that institutions and departments work to develop alternative strategies for how research can still be performed if there is a need to shut down again. On this point, departments should also increase the flexibility of degree requirements to help to mitigate the impacts of research disruptions, so to allow students to still be able to graduate relatively on time. Additionally, and perhaps a bit of a longer term thought, departments need to work to reshape the graduate learning experience such that the quality of education can be upheld through the pandemic if typical research activities can no longer be conducted, and indeed to support future professional development such that graduate students will be able to have access to opportunities and to be able to participate in a challenging and changing economy.
Now we're going to talk about Alex, who's also a research stream graduate student and a lab mate of Quinn in the later stages of their research. Alex was planning to visit family in May, but had to cancel their trip. At the start of the pandemic, Alex was in the midst of data collection for the final chapter of their thesis. They were looking forward to presenting their research at an upcoming international conference, meeting in person with collaborators, and hopefully connecting with future employers. Unfortunately, as with many events, the conference was canceled outright. Alex is worried about the loss of vital networking opportunities and about how this will impact their future prospects. Additionally, as Alex is an international student, they're also worried about graduating on time given the impending expiry of their study permit. And Alex is also concerned about their postgraduate work experience. Alex has made Canada home, and given his contributions and connections to Canadian science, they were quite keen on continuing to work in this country. Alex is concerned about their prospects to do this, given the ongoing challenges in the economy. Like Alex, many other international graduate students were similarly concerned about, were intending to go home, but unable to. And 54% of international graduate students are worried about completing their degree requirements before the expiration of their study permit. And like Alex, students across Canada were concerned about the loss of professional development opportunities. 41% of research stream graduate students felt that the cancellation of conferences would impact their future prospects. Professional stream graduate students also lost the opportunity to obtain valuable internship experiences. 40% of research stream graduate students, 40% of professional stream graduate students said that their internship had been canceled or postponed, and a further 25% were not sure about the state of their internship at the time of the survey. Over 30% of graduate students felt that COVID-19 would have some impact on their ability to complete their degree. This was more prominent in research stream graduate students than in professional stream graduate students, but was true across the board. Of graduate students intending to graduate by August 2020, 17% that they were no longer able to graduate at the time of our survey. And 33, a third of respondents indicated that they were unsure if they would even be able to. Prior to COVID-19, most graduate students weren't going into academia, and the pandemic will only accelerate this trend. This is in the face of a severe dearth of professional development opportunities critical to landing a non-academic job. Supervisors, PIs, academic societies, governments, and institutions, everybody needs to work to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the ability of graduate students to participate in professional development opportunities. Governments need to continue to create and subsidize work experiences to help graduate students prepare for an uncertain job market. Institutions and departments should be redirecting existing conference travel grants to cover any associated costs of participating in new and developing professional development opportunities, particularly as graduate students are not traveling to attend conferences abroad. Institutions and departments should be encouraging and normalizing the participation in additional professional development programs. And institutions should be preparing to transition planned in-person professional development opportunities to a virtual space. Supervisors should also be encouraging their students to learn new skills, even if this doesn't directly relate to their research.
In concluding, it's important to note that graduate students cannot necessarily fully be represented by these two stories or these three stories. Graduate students come from all walks of life and can differ significantly in their struggles. In saying this, we also want to recognize some of the limitations of our survey and of the report that came off those findings. There are indeed accessibility concerns about who may have been able to respond to the survey. Certain students may not have been able to for a variety of reasons. We also note that our survey did not go into depth about some of the particular concerns regarding certain groups of graduate students that may have unique burdens to face. For example, those who have different accessibility requirements through their studies, student parents additionally. We also note that in terms of representation, we did have something of an overrepresentation of white female students in particular. So we were not able to do subgroup analysis and to specifically address whether there were unique concerns and whether there were unique burdens for certain kinds of students or certain students with different identities. For example, students who were members of visible minorities, members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community, Indigenous students as well. While we did touch on some of the concerns of many of these different kinds of students, particularly student parents and international students, there is more work that needs to be done to help to support these students and to understand their graduate student experience and how this intersects with other identities and other lived experience. We also need to ensure that we find ways to help to increase the support that we provide to these students. To conclude, we want to re-emphasize the tremendous importance of graduate students to getting out of this pandemic, to facing up to the challenges of the future, to the crises of the future, and even helping to perhaps prevent them in some cases. Evidence-informed decision-making needs graduate students. As we work towards a recovery plan for Canada, and specifically a recovery plan for science, because there will be a need for a recovery plan for science, it is vital that trainees be considered at the heart of this recovery plan. And here, when we say trainees, we include certainly graduate students, but also postdoctoral scholars and early career researchers, all of whom will have a greater burden to bear as a result of the impacts of this pandemic. It is vital that trainees be the focus of the Canadian Recovery Plan so that we can ensure that science has a strong future and we can continue to provide an engine of innovation for this country. To get to this, what we really need to do is to advocate. We need to advocate for increased support for graduate students to decision makers within our institutions and across various levels of government.
And so what does advocacy mean for us? So at TSPN, we're working on writing a number of op-eds. This is one that we published while the survey was open in partnership with SBE and E4D. And we're also trying to generate interest about the experience of graduate students in the media. And we were actually featured in City News and in Nature Careers in the past couple weeks. We also submitted a budget to the 2021 budget recommendations for the federal government and plan to do the same thing when this opens for the provincial level. We're also developing tools and to highlight key findings from our report to help graduate students advocate for themselves. And these graphics are something that we're releasing every day this week about different sections of our survey. We're also sharing our report directly with decision makers, emailing it to administration and to members of the government. And so what we're asking you to do is we're asking institutions to advocate for your graduate students. Supervisors, advocate for your graduate students. Apply the recommendations that we've suggested in our report and talk about these recommendations and these findings at your next faculty and departmental meetings. Academic societies, we're asking you to advocate for your graduate students. Provide professional development opportunities and opportunities for your graduate students and your members at large to network while we're all working from home. Student unions and student groups, we're asking you to advocate for your graduate students by talking to them, find out what specific issues they might be experiencing, and sharing this report with your department and at your institutions. Do not let your institution ignore the results of this report. They're very striking and display what the precarity of the graduate student experiences that many face. And graduate students, we're asking you to take an active role in participating in science advocacy and policy efforts if you can. We're a student group that's based at the University of Toronto, but we are open to anyone interested in participating and helping out with this project. In fact, many of our members are not affiliated with UFT, and that we welcome people from different institutions attending our events and participating in our advocacy initiatives. I want to say thank you again to all the contributors from Toronto Science Policy Network that made this work possible. And I also want to take a moment to thank our reviewers who provided some very critical and valuable feedback for the report. And also thank you to all the survey respondents who took the time to fill out the survey and share their stories and their very personal experiences with us. I also, again, to conclude, I also want to thank the UFT COVID-19 Student Engagement Award, who's helping send the Toronto Science Policy Network to the Canadian Science Policy Conference in 2020. So this is taking place in November, where TSPN is hosting a panel about the early impacts of COVID-19 on the next generation of scientists. And we're going to be talking about the results of our survey, but we're also going to be hearing from different groups. So Science and Policy Exchange, the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars, and the authors of a recent preprint by Seward et al. About how graduate students and early career researchers what they're experiencing during the pandemic and what recommendations and what changes they can make to improve their situation. With that, I want to thank you all for your attention and thank you, Evidence for Democracy, for giving us this platform. We're open to any questions you may have.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those results. Such a fantastic report. I mean, I really enjoyed reading it. I think the recommendations are so great, and it's so nice to see some visible steps that our community can take. So thank you to both of you for sharing that. So I see we're already starting to see some questions in the chat and the Q&A box. So I think I'm going to sort of get to some of these already. So first, a couple of sort of broad things that I've seen in the questions. For everyone who's attending, you will get a recording of today's webinar sent to you after this event. So yes, the slides will be available as well. The webinar will be available. We're also going to make sure that the webinar has closed captioning. We had a question about the accessibility features on Zoom today, and we unfortunately weren't able to have captioning for anyone who might be hard of hearing in today's webinar. So I apologize for that, but we are looking into it, and we're going to try and make sure that, we will make sure that there's captions as well in the recording. So a couple of things just sort of on the housekeeping space. There's also just a question right now about the full reference to Stewart et al. Sivani, I think that you mentioned that you could also distribute it, correct? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think we can drop the link in the chat.
There it is.
Emma has the link.
It's already there. Also, another sort of like broad housekeeping question, the CSPC conference is online. So it will be, I think conference, I know that conference registration is already up. So for those of you interested in CSPC, it will be online. So there we go. All right, so getting into some of the questions that I see online. So there's been a couple of questions broadly about intersectionality, so maybe I'll try and loop them in together. So I know Frank spoke a little bit about some of the challenges of representation in this study, as well as some of the challenges that intersectional groups might face with regard to COVID-19. So I guess trying to summarize the questions that are in the Q&A, is there any follow-up for support for intersectionality or intersectional groups? And what are some of the resources available on campus? I guess you probably can only speak to U of T, but any of the resources available online to support intersectional groups, especially in light of COVID?
So for TSPN right now, we really want to acknowledge that because of the way we distributed our survey, it was all self-selected. We didn't get a very diverse representation from different groups. So as Frank mentioned, our respondents were mostly female and white. So from our perspective, we do believe that the results of our survey are still representative of the majority of student experiences. What we wish to acknowledge is that different people in different circumstances may actually be experiencing some of these, they may be actually experiencing more difficult circumstances because of their personal experiences. And so for us, while this is not something that we have the scope to really address in detail and do justice to, it's something that we wish to really strongly acknowledge. And we do encourage people visit, there's often caucuses at their student union groups that they can reach out to for support. And especially at U of T, that is an option. But unfortunately within TSPN, we can't make this survey mean more than it is currently. So it is a limitation of our work.
That's great. Thank you for that. I'm taking a look at these. So I just wanted to also remind people that you can use both the chat function and the Q&A function. So I'm following along in both. Let me take a look here. Sorry, I'm just reading through them. So I guess this, maybe you probably can't answer this specifically, but someone asked if there's research for specific countries. I think they probably mean attending regarding graduate students on health and wellness with regard to COVID. So I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but I think it's still an important question. This is a Canadian survey. Have there been other surveys looking at things like health and wellness for students after COVID-19?
So I would say on the mental health question in particular, we cited from one particular study that was done again. So in the introduction, I cited from one particular study and mentioned something from a different study relating to mental health prior to the pandemic. But what I would want to flag is that there really is a dearth of survey. There's really a dearth of data about the specific mental health experiences of graduate students. There's a building understanding over the last few years that graduate students have particularly poor mental health outcomes. And indeed, there is some country-specific data. So there is some data that's specific to the UK. I believe they did one particular study. There's some particularly American data. So yes, there's some country-specific data, but largely it's something that's not really well researched. And that's something that I kind of also alluded to in one of the reasons why we wanted to do this survey, is because graduate students specifically are not a group that are very well studied. They're a group that does have obviously an importance to society in terms of the science and scholarship that they produce. They're again, the backbone of that science and scholarship, but they aren't particularly well studied. So the unique experiences that they're going through are not well understood. In terms of other surveys on the impacts of COVID-19 on graduate students and on science and on academia, we did flag a few related to postdoctoral scholars, early career researchers, and so on that will be on our panel. There was also a UK study that came out which looked at graduate students and the early impacts, very, very parallel to ours, but obviously looking at a different population. And there was another that was done in Australia, specifically focused on, I believe it was the University of Sydney, so doctoral students specifically at the University of Sydney, and looking at the impacts on them. So if people are interested in looking at those and seeing how the Canadian experience compares to some other experiences in terms of the early impacts, those are available. In terms of the specific contents of them, they're not entirely like ours. So the mental health question might be a little different, but those are very interesting as well.
Thanks for that. I agree. It's a really understudied group. And I think this is a nice kind of question to follow up to this, because it's something I think about as well. So this question is asking about, they asked regarding the lack of guidelines and expectations around lab openings and access to research spaces and funding and all of the things you sort of spoke about. Do you think that this is a consequence of grad students and postdocs? Their precarious position is not quite employees, not quite students. So they're sort of specifying that institutions may not know how to target messages to research trainees because they don't have the stringent course requirements of undergrads, all the professional pressures of paid employees, and none of the financial support. So I guess they're asking about that sort of precarious position of grad students. Do you think that that had something to do with it, because it's that sort of strange in between?
I definitely think so, because I think if you speaking to other people in different situations, you'll hear that different people in different departments and different positions, even within the institution, were receiving different information, and we're all on different email lists at institutions. So I do think that that plays a large role in what information gets passed on. Oftentimes, I think it's expected that our PIs kind of pass down the information to us, but perhaps they don't have specific information that goes directly to us. And there's a lot of there's not a cohesive communication flow or to how graduate students should be accessing and receiving that information. So
yeah. This is a really interesting question, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. So the question is, you highlighted that 70% of grad students are challenged to obtain funding. Is there an ideal level for this statistic? If you say 0%, so none of them are challenged to find funding, does that prepare them for the competitively funded system that they're moving into?
So I would say that the circumstances of graduate students in particular are somewhat different, especially depending on the institution and the country and so on. In many instances, graduate students are paying tuition to also do research. So there are very different concerns relative to just getting, obviously, there's importance to funding science broadly. I think that we need to put more money into funding science so that there doesn't need to be as minimal a success rate for competitions for funding for grants. But that doesn't preclude that there should also not be, we're talking about graduate students today. We're not talking about science broadly, but I would say that the concerns are different. I think that graduate students are paying tuition, and that's a big concern, particularly in certain cities where they're not able to perhaps, a lot of these institutions, for example, I'm here in Toronto, the cost of living is very elevated here. There's not really an ability to get another job because you're a full-time student and so on. So I think the concerns are different, because the funding here is really going primarily to your ability to support yourself while you participate in the research. So I think there's some subtleties in terms of the concerns there.
I actually want to add to that, and I want to say if we bring that number to 0, that would be amazing. But then you could also have your competitions to say, this is your base level of graduate student funding. And if you want to make more than that, that could be the competition. There's no need to make it a competition to receive basic levels of funding for graduate students. That should not be something that graduate students have to fight for when they're doing such basic research.
I feel like there's so many things that we can sort of add to this conversation, but I feel that that's a different conversation. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. I want to encourage people that if they have other questions, to bring them on board. Maybe I'll ask you sort of broadly. I mean, for some of our community members, this will be the first time for them getting involved with your work at TSPN. So you mentioned some of the ways that you guys have prepared for our community to get involved, but can you point us to any of the sort of upcoming work for TSPN? What are your next endeavors at the organization?
So we're figuring out how we're going to do this virtual academic year. We really enjoy holding panels and public panels. So this is something that we have a couple ideas for in the fall. So this is where we invite a couple different speakers and we talk about some key policy topics. So in the past, we've done climate action, we've talked about the Ontario sex ed curriculum, and we had to actually, due to COVID-19, we actually canceled our Toronto transit panel. So these are things that we're going to be planning, and so we're just getting the new team started on working on these kind of topics.
That's
in
great.
terms of getting involved in this particular kind of advocacy work, we are always keen, if anyone is interested in any of the kinds of things we talked about today, or feels passionately about a particular group of graduate students, or feels passionately about a particular issue that we discussed, we are super keen to assist people or to have people participate in some of this work through, if anyone wants to work on an op-ed, or if people are interested in connecting with people at their institution, we can help them. We can give them some resources in terms of best practices for how to reach out. We have a lot of experience, a lot of different letters and that kind of thing. We'll be working on this point. We're going to be moving forward with writing some more specific summaries for different kinds of practitioners, so specific summaries that might be able to be targeted towards if you have a federal representative you want to connect with, or particular summaries to talk to your supervisor or to talk to your department, those kinds of things. So we're preparing resources like that, preparing more infographics. Sivani alluded to this week, we're going to be sharing a number of different sort of section by section infographics. We'll be sharing other larger scale infographics over the course of the week. So if people want to share those, that's sort of a smaller barrier to entry kind of thing. So there's lots of ways to get involved in this work.
Yeah, and I think so. There's two things I want to follow up on that, actually. So I mean, we can also support in that as well. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the resources that we have available at E4D, if you go to our training page on evidencefordemocracy.ca, there's also a lot of free trainings that we have available to help you take the results of the report done by TSPN and put them into action in your community. So that means, maybe meeting with an elected official. We have resources on how to do that effectively, how to contribute to things like budget consultations, how to communicate science to policymakers. So if you're interested in tangible tools to help you take the results of this survey into action, E4D's community can help support with that as well. I feel like this is also a really great time to ask. I'm going to ask them together because there's been two great questions in our Q&A about how to continue this conversation. So somebody asked if there's discussion sort of in breakout groups after today's talk. Unfortunately, no today. Given the fact that this is a webinar format, we didn't have the sort of time and space to do breakout rooms, but I do think that that's a good question that I can maybe pose to you for how, if people are sort of passionate about continuing in this conversation, how can they continue the conversation with you and with other students who are passionate about these issues?
Well, first off, we encourage everyone to visit our website or email us directly. I don't know if we can drop our email in the chat, but if you are really interested in talking with us one-on-one, we're happy to do that. For moving forwards, this is something, like Frank mentioned, we're all graduate students experiencing the pandemic. We were hearing anecdotally from our friends, from people we know, and about how they were struggling and how we were struggling. And so that is really what led us to do this. And I think we need support. We need to gather support from institutions, from our supervisors, from our departments, to actually launch these kind of initiatives and to get more people on board, because it really shouldn't be graduate students or graduate students should be involved in these kind of works, but perhaps they shouldn't be the ones spearheading these kind of changes and these kind of supports. They 100% should be part of the conversation, but really to kind of assign that to graduate students, to put that onus on them, seems sort of strange to me.
I completely agree with what Sivani is saying. I would just build that if people do have, though, a particular passion for some of these issues, if they have a particular idea for something that they think that a group like ours can do or that they want to be part of, we will actually, over the course of the next month, be having a number of open meetings where people can bring these to the table and we can work to try to, create more advocacy work and create more capacity for advocacy, for science advocacy, and for advocacy of graduate students across the country. We'll be having a brainstorming meeting on September 12th. Later in the month, we'll be having an open general meeting just to discuss these kinds of issues and see, we're very much a member-driven group. So if anyone is interested in a particular issue or what have you, if they think that there would be an excellent idea for a panel that they would want to see, we're super keen on having all those ideas and having these kinds of discussions because, as Sivani mentioned in the beginning of her answer there, really we are driven by our experiences. So we are super keen on having more experiences, more lived experiences that we can all learn from and that we can do right by.
Yeah, and I also want to flag too that, if you are interested in participating in things like online networking events, I mean, given the fact that COVID-19 is happening, a lot of the in-person networking events where you would be able to find a lot of other people who are, in the same space working on this, they're not happening, but there are still online networking events that are happening. If this is something that you are passionate about meeting other people who are doing, you can either email us at E4D or TSPN and get added to our mailing lists, and we can keep you updated if there's events that you might be interested in participating in. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add, because specifically going back to that question about breakout rooms and further discussion about the report, at the Canadian Science Policy Conference, that the format of that panel will actually be more of a 5-minute talk about each of the different recommendations from the different groups, and will mostly be a discussion. So if you are interested in furthering specifically the discussion about supporting graduate students and early career researchers and talking about how we can facilitate that, I really do encourage you to sign up for the Canadian Science Policy Conference and for that panel specifically.
Yep, for sure. And I will also follow up with that too, that we do at E4D a number of these kinds of webinars, and oftentimes we'll bring in guests like this to help share their own work and their findings. And I see someone had asked specifically a question about, continuing this conversation around some of the specific areas of focus, something like neglected communities or, funding, things like that. We are going to also send a feedback form for today's webinar. So in that form, you'll be able to give feedback on today's event, but then also you can recommend topics that might be of interest to you for future events as well. So if there's something that you are really passionate about that you feel didn't get covered enough today that you'd love to have another more in-depth conversation about, feel free to let us know as well. So I think we're just about sort of 2 minutes from the end today. So I want to wrap up. It looks like we did answer all the Q&A questions, but if something comes up for any of you today who attended, please feel free to pass them along. You should have all of the information from your registration. But I want to say a big thank you to both of you for coming today and for sharing this really important and really interesting work. It's a really exceptional report, and I'm super happy that you came and shared it with us today. So thanks to E4D, and thank you to all of you for attending, and we'll send along the recording fairly soon. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks to E4D.